Well, the winner of the 2025 Nobel Literature Prize is László Krasznahorkai, the Hungarian novelist and screenwriter. He was predicted potentially to win on the bookies markets. He is known as a demanding writer, postmodern writer, quite innovative. His most recently translated English book is Baron Wankheim's Homecoming, but other famous books or well-known books are Santiago, The Melancholy of Resistance. Some of his books have been turned into films. I'm going to be writing a little bit more about László Krasznahorkai in my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com, on the weekend, on Saturday, as well as letting you know about my upcoming read of the Mahabharata. So do check it out. And László Krasznahorkai is the 122nd winner of the Nobel Prize. I've read like about 3 pages of his writing, but I will be reading some more on Substack. And last year I read all 121 winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Here are 5 things I learned reading them. Thanks for watching. In this video, I want to talk about 5 lessons I learned by reading every one of 122 winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature. It's been awarded since 1901, and last year I set myself a demanding challenge over 120 days to read at least a little bit of every one of those Nobel Prize literatures, the greats of modern literature. And here are the 5 things I learned from them. They're both about literature and culture, but they're also about history. So I'm sharing this video both on my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com, as well as on both my World Literature Archive YouTube channel and my main Burning Archive YouTube channel. It was surprisingly easy and fun to do. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone else do the mad idea I had, which was to read 120 winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 120 days. That was a bit of a mad challenge I set myself. But what I did find was that so many of these books are easily accessible on the internet or in public libraries, and frankly, many of them are really a joy to read. Even some of the obscure ones who I had absolutely no idea who they were. And of course, fortunately, many of the winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature were poets. You don't have to read big, long novels. And I'm certainly not claiming that anyone should try to read every book by every winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. There's not enough time in life to do that. But by opening your eyes to some new discoveries, by just looking through the list of the winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature, you can put yourself back into different times, into different cultures, different places, and different styles of writing. It really was a lot of fun. What I found in reading 120 Nobel Prizes in Literature was there is always a reason for them getting the prize. There is something important and valuable, beautiful even, in this literature that people over time have appreciated, even perhaps the least deserving, the most controversial of the winners. People like, for me, Bob Dylan. I still find it hard to accept that Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016, but I have to admit, many people find great joy in his lyrics, so maybe I should be less of a pedantic old bore. But then again, Winston Churchill won the Nobel Prize in 1953 when he was the serving Prime Minister in Britain, and I'm sure he had staff to help him write his speeches. And others say writers like Pearl Buck are perhaps populist writers who did not really deserve the Nobel Prize. But each of those cases have characteristics, have text. Who cannot remember Winston Churchill's speeches that are lasting parts of our shared legacy of literature and world history? And part of the fun, part of the joy of looking back over 120 Nobel Prizes in literature, or however many you choose to do, is discovering those stories, discovering the genius of forgotten writers, the insights of infamous writers, and connecting with people all over the world who find different favourites. For example, the 1955 winner from Iceland, Halldór Laxness, wrote a book, I think it was called Independent People, which the other day I was by chance talking to someone at an event, and I'm mentioning the fact that I'd read the Nobel Prize, and this person out of the blue said, "Have you read Independent People by Laxness?" And I said yes, because I went back over the list of the Nobel Prize in literature, and this extraordinary story written by a man in Iceland, 80 years ago, really was an extraordinary connection between people. The third lesson for me from reading the Nobel Prize in literature has been that it is a window onto the cultural history of the modern world. If we just talk at the moment about the time sequence, the sort of chronology of what I discovered, because I really didn't know quite what this story of the Nobel Prize in literature would reveal when I began reading them from 1901 to 2024. But in the first 10 to 15 years of the prize, you really get a sense of the dominance of particularly Germanic culture in Europe, also French, but particularly the sort of pan-Germanic culture. This was perhaps the era of the greatest, it was a high point of modern German culture before, of course, the 1920s, 1930s and 1940s. You learn about the experience of World War I, the people who celebrated it, the people who opposed it, the people who were scarred by it. You learn about the impact of the 1920s and 1930s, not just in the United States, not just the cliched images of what was happening in the Great Gatsby or in London at the time, but from all the countries that won prizes in the 1920s and 1930s, including extraordinary stories that will link up, of course, to the great tragedy of World War II. During the 1930s, you also see the rise of America, the United States of America, to cultural influence. One of the first winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature at the end of World War II was the Chilean writer Gabriel Mistral. And you also see the dominant emergence of Atlantic culture, particularly Anglo-American culture in the 1950s and 1960s, a growing radicalism and a resurgence of, post-colonial literature and the struggles of the Cold War. So ultimately then the breakdown, the changing social mores about the balance of power across the world, the balance of power between genders, and the perspectives on the breakdown of the ideological divide between the capitalist and the communist world after 1989. Fourthly, the Nobel Prize in Literature is a wonderful window on the whole of world literature. Of course, it is not a perfect representative sample of all world literature. It's only from 1901 after all, but it does give you a access point that I think is quite unique in its breadth and its depth and its connection with many of the cultures around the world. Now, there are clearly places and peoples who are and languages that are underrepresented in that group. Perhaps the most glaring underrepresentation is South Asia. If we put aside Vers Naipaul, the only South Asian to win the Nobel Prize was Rabindranath Tagore, all the way back in 1913. I do wonder whether in 2025 the Nobel Committee will put that right. And arguably Russia, Soviet Union has also been underrepresented. But notwithstanding that, it shakes up your fixed views of the hierarchies of world literature. It introduces you to different national literatures, different sub-national literatures. There's writers in Occitan, there's writers in different dialects, there are writers from countries that no longer exist. And also, what I think is most striking is the interchange between cultures. You can go back to some of the early winners of the Nobel Prize in the 1900s, 1910s, even the 1920s, who are writing about the Buddha in their texts, who are deeply influenced by Indian and other Asian traditions writing from Europe in that way. You can look at the great modernist Knut Hamsun, who became something of an infamous winner of the Nobel Prize because of his later support for both collaborationist Norway and Nazi Germany, but who is widely recognised, despite that, as being one of the most important founders of modernism, but not one who's often emphasised in the Anglophone world. You learn about writers like Miguel Angel Asturias, the Guatemalan writer who won the prize in 1967 and was an extraordinary blender, a prefiguration of Marquez's magical realism, but also an explorer of the various indigenous cultures of Central America. And then you have writers like Annie Ernaux, the French writer from 2022, and her extraordinary use of almost like documentary sort of narratives. And of course, there is Rabindranath Tagore, the great writer from Bengal in 1913, who won the prize only a few years after that other British or Indian writer, Rudyard Kipling, won the prize. Finally, reading all the Nobel Prizes in literature is a wonderful, fantastic journey through modernism itself. Captured the literary, the cultural, the artistic form and movement and disposition almost of modernism that has defined so much of the art, the culture, the sensibility of the 20th century, even if it is now very much declining in the 21st century. The very earliest winners, the very first winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature was an opponent of modernism. And Virginia Woolf once wrote that in a certain date in 1910, human character itself changed. And that flowed through not just in literature, but in the way of life. And from 1910, you see the floodgates of the Nobel Prize in Literature open to the great modernists. Thomas Mann wins in the 1920s. T.S. Eliot wins in the late 1940s. Samuel Beckett in the late 1960s. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself was very much not just a master of magical realism, but an absolute master, deeply, deeply influenced and adaptive and creative himself within the traditions of modernism. Marquez is as much a modernist writer as any of those others. And then on to more recent years where one starts to see almost the breakdown of modernism into postmodernism or even into something different itself beyond the whole question of whether we still live in modernity itself. Of course, there are many, many ways to enjoy the Nobel Prize in Literature. It really does help to be able to just sample and enjoy a bit of poetry, a bit of fiction, a few essays. There are some philosophers. There is even one historian, Theodore Mommsen, the second winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1902, whose great histories of Rome very much defined the early 20th century sort of scholarly mind. And I very much approach reading literature from a historical point of view. I'm no literary critic. I'm a person who appreciates literature and reads literature in a way to enter imaginatively into the worlds of other peoples, other cultures, and other times. And it's that kind of fantastic journey through history that I think the Nobel Prize in Literature can offer you. It was expressed most beautifully by the 2018 winner of the Nobel Prize, Olga Tokarczuk, in her book, The Books of Jacob, which she describes as a fantastic journey through history, aided by imagination, the which being the greatest natural gift of any person, that the wise might have it for a record, that my compatriots reflect, laypersons gain some understanding, and melancholy souls obtain some slight enjoyment. I did a slow read of this wonderful book by Olga Tokarczuk at my Substack. You can access it now, and I'm actually doing a rerun of it through the Substack notes function, so you can join any time and pick up the story at any time and follow it through at your pace. And I'll also be doing a slow read shortly, or an introduction, I should say, to the great Indian South Asian epic, the Mahabharata, and its extraordinary stories which have perhaps been underrepresented in the modernist literary tradition. But I certainly want to encourage more readers to appreciate and enjoy, just as I learnt to value them, by discovering Peter Brook's wonderful theatrical cinematic presentation of the Mahabharata that has just recently been released. as in a newly mastered edition as a film. So please do join me over there at jeffrich.substack.com. Learn more from history, learn different things from literature, and get more out of your reading from history and literature by joining me over at jeffrich.substack.com. Thanks for joining me.